Listen only mode.
Welcome to the Practice Discipleship Training Project. My name is Dawn Troutman. I'm from Lutheran Life Coach, and you can find out more about me at lutheranlifecoach.com, and I am coming to you today from the Rocky Mountain Synod. This project is a result of the partnership between the ELCA Youth Gathering and the ELCA Youth Ministry Network. The goal is to provide quality training opportunities for adults who are bringing youth to the gathering and for adults doing any kind of ministry with young people. The overall point is we want to equip adults to do excellent ministry with young people. We are in the middle of a series of 7 webinars, and today is the middle, exactly, it's the 4th webinar. The design team was intentional to have the first 2 webinars really focus on our theology. It's our foundation from which all our skills, strategies, and ideas flow, and you can hear those as well as your role as a leader on our website, and I will say the name of that website a lot at the end, and it will also appear on your screen. Today you see we're at strategic planning, and we'll continue on in the next few weeks and months with leading a small group, faith conversations, and planning for the unexpected. So today's webinar is we have Tiger McLuen with us, and he is the president of Youth Leadership. Tiger will be presenting, and then there will be lots of time for questions and discussion. So please listen as he is presenting. Type your questions in at any point. I will keep those and ask him and pass them on to him at a point in the conversation where it fits. If you look to the right side of your screen, there is a box, and that is where you type in your questions. And we'll get to as many questions as we possibly can. But let's move on to Tiger. So welcome, Tiger.
Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are.
Wherever we are. Thank you for being with us. I'd love, before we jump into the content, can you tell me just a little bit about yourself outside of your ministry?
Well, I've been involved in youth ministry for a long time. I also have a wife and 3 kids. Outside of that, I enjoy riding motorcycle, boating, and right there where you are, Dawn, the Chipotle is my lunch of choice.
I had Chipotle today. So thank you, Tiger. So let's jump into the content, and when we get to different stopping points, then I'll feed some of the questions to you. Is that okay?
Sounds great.
Great.
Well, good afternoon. We're going to be talking today about strategic planning, and having been in youth ministry a long time, I have to tell you that it's basically nothing really fancy. It's trying to turn ideas into reality. And I have to tell you, it didn't come naturally to me at first. I was your classic, go get it, try it, what am I thinking of next weekend, plan the meeting on the way to the meeting. And over the course of years, I've learned that this strategic planning thing is really important. And it's not just building grandiose mission statements. It's really trying to have some focus. You know, being an energetic, busy youth worker, you can always fill your calendar, but one of the things I've come to understand is all of us are hoping that our programs make a difference, that youth ministry makes a difference, that our summer event that we're planning is a good one. But I want to remind you something this afternoon, and that is that hope is not a strategy. Hope is not something, is more than that. It's God bless you for the feeling, but hope is not a strategy. What we're trying to talk about today is a strategy that follows your good intentions. We're not just doing things to fill the calendar. We're not just doing events to do something. It's not just having nice people with good intentions. That really isn't enough. In fact, I've said often that good intentions is not enough. It's nice to have good intentions for this summer. It's nice to have good intentions for youth group. But what we're trying to do in this session is to think something beyond that, because I see people resting on good intentions a lot. And strategic planning is trying to add some clarity and focus to good ideas, to programs, to hopes and good intentions. And I don't know about you, but I'm easily distracted, and I can easily just start doing stuff and to keep doing the things that I've done before, whether it be a big event in the summer, going to the gathering, going on a mission trip. But what planning is about is to begin to have some focus around that. A phrase, if some of you have heard me before, is vagueness is killing the church. vague ideas that sound good, have a little bit of God in them, have some, some good stuff, but it's about good programs, good intentions, a nice calendar, but vagueness is killing us. A vague program will always produce a vague response. And those of us in ministry have to start asking, in terms of strategic planning, what is the focus? What are we aiming for? Why am I here? Would be a key question you want to ask. What's the point of all this? What are we hoping to accomplish with all of this? It's not just about being organized. Strategic planning isn't about running the details better, although it might include that. It really is a theological question. Why am I here? What are we hoping God will accomplish in the lives of kids? And I don't know about you also, but asking that question helps me slow down just for a minute. Why am I here? Sometimes to ask that question in the parking lot before you run into the building. Sometimes as you're thinking about this summer, ask the question, why are we here? Why are we going to the gathering? We'll come back to this and want you to engage with this. What are the hopes that we have for this trip, this mission trip, this taking kids to a retreat? Another phrase that I've heard a long time ago is youth ministry without a vision becomes a youth group. And that reminds me that if you just keep doing stuff, I'm not opposed to youth group. Youth group is a great thing. But if it's just something we do, then we may miss the point. Vision is trying to name the key goal of the weekly event, of the group, of the summer trip, of the gathering. What's the key goal? Because you and I have to understand and be reminded of the fact that all programs are a means to an end, not an end in itself. The minute a program becomes an end in itself, I would argue that it's the kiss of death to that program. We begin to lose sight of the strategic nature of what we're doing. And so when we just start doing the thing to do the thing, then we lose any sense of vision behind it. Now that goal can be fun. I'm not opposed to that as a goal, but we need to be clear about that. Fun is sometimes the top goal. Other times, fun is a means to the end. It's a part of the way we get there. Maybe the goal is community building. Maybe it's learning. Maybe it's growth. Maybe it's effective service. Whatever it is, we have to be clear about that. So even as we think about summer, the question becomes, why go to the gathering? Why go to the special event? Why take people on a mission trip? Why do we go on the retreat? To name the key goals is a critical piece to this. Without these, there becomes, I would argue, very little passion because we just run the thing. If the reason we do the thing, whatever the thing is, the weekly thing or the special thing, if the reason we do the thing is to do the thing, there's very little passion there. And you might miss the real reason. So I like this definition of vision. You know, sometimes vision can be big and scary, but here's a definition that I like. It's a picture of the future that produces passion. And I'd like you to think about that for a minute, maybe jot some thoughts down about that. What is it that gets you excited about ministry to students? What is it that gets you excited about this coming summer? I know there's a lot of details. I know there's buses to rent and places to stay and all the schedule. But when you think about the vision, the picture of the future as it relates to students' lives on this trip, what produces passion in you? Once you begin to name those things, I think you're beginning to do strategic planning. Because if you can clarify what you're hoping to accomplish, remember you can't control all of it, but you want to aim at something. The old phrase, aim at nothing, you're sure to hit it. What are your thoughts about the intentionality about that? What's your congregation's purpose for going to the gathering? Is it just to go? Is it to see a good event? Is it to build community? It's to see kids' lives impacted. The more you can clarify that, the more it'll help you be intentional. I don't know if you remember Terry Dalton's webinar. She talked about the context that we live in right now, which is moralistic therapeutic deism, which is basically a vague theology, not Christ-centered. And most kids we find in that study have nice feelings about religion, but it doesn't impact them. And so strategic planning speaks into this. It's not just a good program, but it's programs with some intentionality. It's about dreaming about the outcomes. It's about trying to name some goals and hopes that you have. So strategic planning, sometimes we think a problem with a couple things. We think vision, we start thinking really big and vague, when in fact it's very clear. In strategic planning, we sometimes think is about planning all the details. And what we're trying to do here is help you suggest that it's when you get started by naming what do we want to do, why do we want to do that, what are the outcomes we hope for. And the more we think about that, the more we have some opportunity to have interaction about that. Again, the question becomes, what are some of your dreams for the event? And what steps could you do to get close to that goal? What would it take to make that happen? I was talking with a youth worker, and he was talking about the fact that he changed the way that he was going to go to the trip this year, the gathering. That they used to go with lots of other groups, lots of other churches, and make it a community event. But the context is different this year. He has a new group, and a primary goal is to build community within that group. So he made the strategic decision to not go with other groups, that this travel year will be just his group. That's an example of strategic planning. The decision on how he's going to go to the gathering comes out of a sense of clarity as to what the needs of these kids are, and what does that look like. What are your dreams for those? What steps does it take? I have to say I do remember a negative image a few years ago back in New Orleans, not this last one, but the one before that. And at the end of the event, a youth worker asked me to take his picture of him with 11 guys smoking cigars on Bourbon Street at midnight in front of an inappropriate business establishment. And my thought in my head was, is this the image that you want to suggest why you came to New Orleans? Is this the image of what it is that your primary hope was? And I walked away a bit discouraged, because in the attempt to have fun, he missed the opportunity to have some clarity about what that issue was. As I talked to him, it was very unclear for him, other than the event itself and just being there. So what's that about? There are a couple scripture passages. I'm just going to put up the generic. Deuteronomy chapter 6 is one that just suggests, if you remember the context, that the focus in this section is about teaching the important things about our faith to the next generation. Impress these things on your children. And then there's a list of intentional steps of binding on your forehead, etc. That isn't the context of we would use those methods. But Deuteronomy 6 reminds us that it isn't just good intentions. It requires specific actions. Another one is in Joshua 4, which I love, that is a story of intentionality, where they cross over into the Promised Land. And as they're just about to get done, they had the miracle of the Jordan being held up. They all crossed over. And Joshua told the leaders of the 12 tribes, go back into the river, and each of you grab a stone, bring it to the edge of the river, and stack the rocks, the stones, on the side of the river. And then they did that. As soon as they did that, the Jordan flowed again. And they began to stack it up, and someone asked, so why are we doing this? And he said, so that when your children come and they see these rocks, they'll ask, why did you do that? And you can tell them the story of God's work. To me, that's an image of strategic planning. It's creating markers. It's creating plans, hopes for what it is you want to do, and how will that create the faith conversations that are important. Why are we doing this? So that our students can ask us about God and begin to move into that. Just thinking about that, and don't know if that has stirred any thoughts, but remember, vision is not just big picture, not just a mission statement that you write and put in a drawer. It's about having some clarity about why you do things, and then building intentional steps to make that happen. One of the questions I often wonder about, okay, yeah.
Can I jump in with one of the questions, because I think it flows well right here.
Sure, that'd be perfect.
Yeah, Mary is saying, how do we in a group discover or discern God's vision for what we should be doing on an event like the gathering? So I think she's asking, how does the entire group share that vision? How do you discover it and share it so that that can be a unified vision for their trip?
That's a great question, because sometimes the most difficult thing is to move from a personal vision to a shared vision. It's easy for a leader to maybe sit in their office and say, here's the vision. But it's really important to build it broader than that. And I would say the first thing would be the adult leaders. I think the adult leaders are important to set the framework of intentionality. I believe fully in involving students, but I think the adult leaders need to sit down and have this conversation. What are our hopes? What are the things that get us excited? What's our vision, using not vision in a big, broad, sweeping statement, but what's a picture of the future that produces passion? And find out where are the core things that the group of people, that your congregation, as you fundraise, you will hear the story of people, what they're excited about, what they are hoping for, as they tell the story of other trips they've gone on and the impact it's made. Listen to that and begin to articulate that and see if it resonates, and then have students share in that so that they know the expectations. If we're not clear that the expectation of a trip is community building, faith growth, an encounter with Jesus, the kids might just be thinking it's just to go and have a great time. And again, remember, please hear me, I am not opposed to going and having a great time. But if that's the only reason we go, then I think we miss the opportunity for something else. So I would encourage that group, any group, to start the conversation, leader to other leaders. What are we hoping for? What's the intention? What's our dream here? And find those common things that resonate, and then begin to share those with the students so that they know what they're signing up for. And that might be helpful. Does that make sense?
Yes, so it sounds like you're telling Mary to use both formal and informal ways of gathering people's ideas about what the gathering needs to be.
Yes, both. Yes, exactly. Very good.
Great, thank you.
You got any others there?
Not right now, but
okay.
Please, anyone who has questions, keep them coming, and we'll jump in with them as we go along. And honestly, even if you don't have a question, if you have a vision for your trip to the gathering or your summer trip, even if it's not the gathering, type it into that box. We'd love to hear it. We'd love to have examples of some really works in progress or really solid, well thought out visions, whatever it is. What's making you passionate about this summer trip? I'd love to have a few of those responses in the chat box on the right side of your screen. So I'll jump in, Tiger, when we have a few of those.
That's great, because that's exactly what I was thinking. If people could put down, if we were sitting around the table and you'd say, what's getting me excited about the possibility of this trip, that would be great to hear. So I appreciate you saying that. Because one of the things you want to look back on is think about a time when a goal helped you. Maybe you saved money to buy something. Maybe it was sports. Maybe it was grades. What we're talking about here is having a goal that begins to give you, to back up from the goal. You realize, in order to have that happen, I need to do this, 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 and this. And again, I'm trying to not formalize strategic planning. I'm trying to help it become practical. And so think of a time when you had a goal in mind, and maybe even share some of those. What was a goal you had that really allowed you to back up and say, in order to buy that thing, I have to do this. In order to get those grades, maybe it was planning for college, maybe it was something else where you had a very clear goal, and you realized, because I was clear about the goal, I now know what steps I have to take to get there. And that's part of what we're trying to do. It's not just a big idea. Another way to think about this is a diagram out of a book a number of years ago by Stephen Covey, where he said there are two circles that we all tend to travel in. One is called the circle of concern. And that circle of concern is all the things that you wish could happen or wish were different. It's world hunger, and it's teens in the community, or it's all the kids at the gathering, or it's, we start naming big things. And often we write our vision statements around really big things. And what he said was, effective leaders are aware of those things, but what they realize is they have to work inside a smaller circle, and that circle is called the circle of influence. What that means is, yes, you might be concerned about world hunger, but your circle of influence might be sponsoring one child through Compassion International. It might be the kids in your community, but your circle of influence is your small group of 5 kids that you do a Bible study with every week. And in the same way, when you think of a trip, there's a lot of things that get thrown in there. But strategic planning is when you say, inside of my circle of influence, I'm going to make some choices and some practical realities with the 12 kids I have. And therefore, that's who you talk to. That's who you begin to name your core values with, as Mary asked. What are some ways to have that shared conversation so that they know this is going to happen together? Are you just, as you're traveling to the gathering this year, what are some of those things that we've talked about? It's got to be practical. It's got to be specific. It's got to be built on an accurate assessment of your group. Who are the kids that are coming? Because if you just run the trip this year the exact way you ran it 3 years ago, the audience might be completely different. And if you're unaware of the difference in the audience, it may not work. So you have to ask questions about your audience. Who are they? What's the interests they have? What's the spiritual maturity that they have? What are the strengths that they bring, et cetera. So we got to be asking that question about who the audience is. And that helped me change the style and program, for example, of an annual overnight trip that I used to do. With small changes, but it was mostly a fun event, and in the conversation we realized that we needed to change a little bit. And all it did is change a little bit of how we did the community building in the evening overnight part of it. A little bit on how we shared the gospel with a bit more intentionality. So when you do strategic planning, it may not be that it's going to change everything. But I would argue that what it will do is change the little things that will affect how you do the evening debrief maybe, or how you start the day together, or how you do your trip, or some of those practical things. And that will cause you to know some ideas and dreams for the trip.
And Tiger, before you get away from this slide, Annie wrote, wow, that's eye-opening. I love the circles. It helps to focus. So yes. Thank you from Annie.
Okay. Well, this to me, and others, this simple little diagram has been really helpful to me when I get overwhelmed with the circle of concern and I under-focus on the circle of influence. I was just here in Seattle and speaking to high school or middle school kids. And I think about that a lot. I was telling the story of a trip to Honduras that I take now that's become part of my circle of influence. I care about world hunger, but I've learned that I can't change the world, but I can change a small part of the world that God has given me influence over, whether that be in my church or in this weekend here, or when I travel to Honduras working with the one school that we work with. That's trying to be strategic, and it's been helpful to me when I'm getting overwhelmed, as I'm sure a lot of you are listening, get overwhelmed with the bigness of needs, the number of kids who need our help, to start thinking about circle of influence in your small group and in your youth group and on this trip. So I'm glad that was helpful. Any other comments, questions?
Well, I do have from Molly just writing about kind of the goal of going to the gathering. She wrote, in our church we have a very small group of youth and they do not come together weekly for youth group at all. Our goal is to create a launching point to have a youth voice or presence in our church. Thank you, Molly, for writing that in.
Yeah, that's very good. That's a good identifying. Then Molly, to begin to ask, so what are some things that we can do in preparation for the trip, on the trip, and after the trip that will get us closer to that very important goal that you've stated? That's very practical.
Great. And then Karen wrote, our congregation is in flux as our director of student ministry just resigned 3 weeks ago. Our youth are on fire and psyched about the gathering and growing their faith, but the adults in our community are concerned without a person to rein in the ideas. Our vision may dwindle a bit. We are a very large congregation with a lot of dedicated and motivated youth and adult leaders, but are immediately concerned that we may lose our momentum without a leader. Any ideas? Thank you. That was great, Aaron.
Yeah, and sadly that happens. I think what you've stated two things that are really important in this, Karen. You've stated the loss, which is important to note. But you've also stated that there's a large group of people, dedicated, you said, of leaders, adult leaders, and student leaders. I think the key will be to pull those people together who have concern, they have dreams, they have experience, they're, as you said, they're a dedicated group, And don't let them minimize how important it is for them to state these goals, share common values, and work towards a goal without, even though there may not be a paid leader. Whether there's another staff person that can facilitate that, or a couple key leaders. All of this is simply to say, what do we think? Here we are. This is our context. We are staff leaderless. You're not leaderless, by the way. Karen, you have a lot of leaders, it sounds like. What you are is you have loss of a staff leader. And you have to name that context. I would say that the key is to not wait for the leader, but to really name what are the dedicated leaders thinking. And they are now the circle of influence. They're the ones that are going to lead this thing. And they may feel inadequate, but I would argue they can do it if you rally that conversation. That's really critical.
Great. So how would Karen rally that conversation? What does that mean exactly?
Well, I would say that she uses this conversation as an excuse to gather some people together. If she's the only one from the church, she simply says, you know, I sat in on a webinar and they talked about being clear about our goals for our trip to the gathering. And since we lost a staff member, I would like to urge that and invite people to a conversation. And don't feel like by calling it together you have to be the best leader. It's just that use this as an excuse to start something public, which is to say, let's talk about what we really are hoping this gathering will happen. What can we do together? And again, if there's a staff person that's kind of filling in, they should be included in this. But I would say use this as the excuse for making a public conversation. To say, I'm not sure the answer, but it strikes me, or blame me, say, I told you that you need to have this conversation, and then see what happens. Again, what I'm saying is it's got to be practical. If you just go with good intentions and hope that a bunch of people with good intentions are going to figure this out, you probably are going to have 8 different directions. But if you have 2 or 3 conversations, you can narrow it down and really come to an agreement on what's the vision of the future that produces passion in our context.
And,
so
and wonderful. Good. And Karen, you, as a starting point, as Tiger said, you don't have to be the expert. You actually will be able to archive this webinar on our website once it's over. So we'll give you that address at the end, and you can direct the other parents or concerned adults to this actual webinar. It's being recorded right now.
So I will just say to them, you need to meet with Karen and talk about this.
Wonderful. And then Molly is back, helpful to this conversation and maybe also as a general concept. When you recognize people's strength, sometimes they are willing to step up and be a leader. So thank you, Molly.
Yes, very good point. Affirming people's strengths is the best way to draw them out. Yep.
Wonderful. I think we have a little more about application, and then we'll jump back to the questions. Is that right, Tiger?
Yeah. What I'd like to do, another way to think about this is both in terms of youth ministry programming as well as an event, is I suggest a fairly simple, but it has a lot of application. A way to think about this is to say, what are the 4 things that you're hoping for when it comes to an event or a program? And that is, what are you looking for? Because what do you think students need to know in order to be a part of this? What are you hoping that they'll know and understand because they went to the gathering? And that requires preparation sometimes. What do you want them to know before they go on the trip? And hopefully that's more than just knowing the rules of the trip, although that's one of those. But what are some things you want them to know about expectations, about the hopes and dreams for the week? What do you want them to know about, is there any theological things that you want them to know that came out of what Jeremy talked about? One of the things we do know about students is that they're growing up fairly biblically illiterate and often unclear about our own distinctives. And so they don't have a doctrine that they know. And so part of your job is to say, if I want to do a Bible study, what do I want them to know? If I want them to go on a retreat, what do I want them to know both before they go, and what am I trying to teach them while they're there? And don't just let the program do all that. You should be involved in that. What do you want them to know so that maybe when you debrief every night, you cover some basic ideas, or at the morning you do your own Remember today this, and what do they need to know? The second is, what do you want them to be able to do? This is more of an activity orientation question. While they're with you or while they're on the trip, what are you hoping to do? And for some of you, it'll just affect the way you do the trip. What do you want to do along the way? What do you want the group to do together? What do you want to do while you're down there? Maybe there's an afternoon trip you'll take because you want them to do something. Obviously, if you go to the gathering, for example, there's a lot of doing that they will provide for you. But again, don't let the program run everything. Your job is to say, what do my students need to know? And your students are distinctly different than the student in the bus next to you. What do I want my students to do based on my kids, and what would be most helpful for my goals? The third is kind of an application of that. What do I want them to experience? We've known for many years that faith is not just information. It's about experiences. I call them sacred memories. When God shows up in your world and you can't deny it, and I'm always praying for and hoping for a God experience. So that's one of the things. What am I hoping to experience? By the way, you can't control the outcome of the experience. I mean, you can't schedule God for Thursday, although we try to do that. It's more about what am I really most excited about when I think of students being able to experience service, experience being in a room with thousands of other teenagers if you're going to the gathering, or experience the power of a retreat and moving out of their normal schedule and debriefing and disconnecting from technology. What is the experience you're looking for? Again, you can't control all this, but to aim at something is important. And that, even as I think about the leader who changed the way they're going to the trip because they wanted their group to experience more community among their group. It changed travel plans because of an experiential goal. And lastly, the thing we also can't control, but I would encourage you to think about, is what do you want them to become? At the end of the day, what are we hoping our students will become? Because they've been part of our church, part of our youth ministry, part of this summer's experience. And again, don't get caught up in trying to manage or control this, but to dream about it is often missing in a lot of our thinking. What are you hoping will happen in the lives of these students? What will they become because they spent these days on a mission trip or at the gathering? And again, the program will allow some of this, but it's your job to dream and wonder. This will affect your trips, your weekly events, even your individual time. What do you want people to know, do, experience, and become? I would argue that this could be a framework for you to write your curriculum or think about a curriculum for a weekly Bible study, for a youth group, for a trip, a retreat, on a retreat. What do you want them to know, do, experience, or become because of the retreat? So this allows you some way to apply this idea of vision, because vision can get too big, too generic, and it gets too grandiose, whereas these questions will help you drop down a little bit and be specific. So I'd be curious to hear from anybody as to what you would think of as you think of this summer trip. What are you hoping that they would know, need to know before they go, know while they're there? What would you like to do? What would you like them to experience? And ultimately, what's your passionate future dream for them to become? I'd be interested to hear what people have in that regard.
Tiger, Brian from Ohio wrote his vision for the gathering, and he actually wrote it before he had this framework from you on the screen. But he actually answered some of your questions anyway. His vision for the gathering, it says, our hope is that our preparation for and journey of the gathering leads us into transformation that thrives 3 years after the gathering, and how we practice discipleship, peacemaking, and justice more often, deeper, and more costly ways in the lives of students and families in the congregation. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thank you. That's good.
That's really good. Sean has a question along these lines about strategic planning. It says, our church is very youth unfriendly. This is the first year for no Sunday school, no youth sermon. How do we attract youth into an older, unenthusiastic congregation? And John wrote that he's afraid the answer might be finding a new congregation. So he'd love your input.
And Sean, is Sean a volunteer in that situation?
Actually, yeah, it's John, like the book of the Bible.
Okay.
And he did not write. I'm
Okay.
sorry, John, I don't know which John you are. If you could write in whether you're a volunteer
Yeah.
or whether you're on staff, that might help. But can we talk about it a little until
Yes.
John can get
Yeah,
to his
that's
screen?
fine. John's a perfect example of circle of concern and circle of influence. John's looking at a church that, by his definition, is unfriendly, older, uninvolved, and that's a big circle of influence that can get very overwhelming. And I would say that anyone, volunteer or otherwise, can begin to have a strategy on who they might need to know or talk to begin to change that culture. But that's a big task. It starts with key leaders. It does start with conversations with pastor, etc. But at the same time, with all of that, John might be able to say, but within that, how can I help create in my circle of influence a youth-friendly environment, a place where in the hallways we've committed ourselves, the 4 of us or 3 of us or 8 of us, to be the caring adults that look kids in the eyes if they really matter, say hi to them, or show interest in their life, and may not make the most dramatic program change in the world, but they're not going to let the overall circle of concern frustration change how they're going to act to individual teenagers. And maybe it's to work with 3 of them to plan to go on to the gathering or to some event together.
Wonderful. And John says he's the public relations chair. So I think that's a volunteer position. And so
Yes.
It sounds like that fits perfectly into what you're saying.
Yes. And in that public relations chair, he needs to use that circle of influence to talk to the people on the staff about how it is we try to change this culture. If there is no leadership commitment to change the culture, then it's really difficult. But it needs to be addressed.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Annie is asking, as she looks at this no-do experience become, how much should the youth participate in the formulation of the answers to these 4 questions while planning for the gathering?
Again, I'm really big on students being involved, but I would tend to argue that the framework of the conversation should be clear, that the leaders, which is adults, staff, etc., really set the major parts of that framework. In other words, I would argue, and not everybody would agree with it, but I would argue that the wrong question to ask as you gather with 12 kids who have signed up to go to a summer event, or for 30 kids who are part of your youth group, turn to those kids and ask, well, what do you want to do? Because there's a problem with that at a number of levels. One is it assumes kids know their needs versus their wants. It assumes that when you ask the question, what do you want to do on the trip, that they're going to be able to get all 4 parts of this, know, do, experience, and become. I think kids can help shape each of these, apply each of these, help us make sure that what we're doing is relevant. But I would argue that the vision, the basic commitment of the vision for ministry, the vision for an event, at least the framework should be articulated among the leaders that God has provided for that group. Now, there might be others that disagree with that, but I have found that to lower it down to a public conversation, of starting with, well, what do you want to be able to do? Why are you going to go on the trip? Generally lowers it down to the most verbal student in the group who jumps on that right away, and they begin to lead the thing. And I think we need to be leading it, meaning people who are reflective, are, the ones who've gone through this, think about our theology, have a philosophy, understand our role as a leader, as Terry talked about. And it doesn't mean we're dictatorial, but we set the framework. So that's a philosophy that is, to me, about strategic planning. And strategic planning is not just simply throwing out there, hey, what do you want to do on the gathering?
Right. And Rick backed you up with a quote. Rick wrote that Steve Jobs was successful because he would, quote, give people things they didn't even know they needed or wanted yet. So Steve Jobs was leading from the front. We didn't know we needed an iPhone, and now here we are in this webinar using it.
Exactly, yeah. Always good to quote Steve Jobs.
Well, yeah, why not?
No, that's a great quote.
It's helpful. Thank you, Rick. So Dennis wrote that he is in agreement that planning is very important, but it seems that it could tend toward micromanaging the results and not letting the Spirit guide what happens. So how do leaders manage that fine line and not become micromanagers?
That's a great question, and I was trying to identify, and apparently I didn't clear enough. By dreaming about things like becoming, remember we cannot micromanage that. We cannot control that. That's the Spirit's job, to help that experience really appear and the becoming to happen, the transformation to occur. What I'm suggesting here is it's a similar kind of thing about people who say, when I communicate, when I talk, I just want the Spirit to say what the Spirit's going to say. And I agree with that in theory, but I don't agree with the principle, because I often say to people who use that excuse, it's amazing to me how often the Spirit wanders around and never gets to a point. So what I suggest is that we want to be aware that the Spirit's involved in our preparation, our planning, our prayer, our hoping, our dreaming, and trust that, so that when we set the framework, then God can do both with us and through us in the preparation and in the experience itself. So I'm agreeing with Dennis. I do not believe we micromanage. I don't think we try to control outcomes. I don't think we try to force becoming. But what we do is have dreams and hopes that are prayerfully considered, Spirit-driven, and then we participate and watch and observe as we've kind of set the table. In other words, I can't make people eat, but I want to set the table. I want to invite them to the banquet. I want to do what I can do to make sure that the party that I brought them to is well prepared and we're having fun. I can't make them experience anything or enjoy it. That's kind of the image I have, is I would just want to invite them to a well-planned, thoughtful framework that is been Spirit-led. So that's a great concern, Dennis, and I think legitimate that we do not micromanage.
And Dennis just wrote, thank you, that is helpful. So that was a very good answer. Thank you, Tiger.
Good.
And Annie was the person we were just talking with that was saying how much should the youth participate in the formulation of the answers to the 4 questions. And you were saying lead from the front. And Annie also wrote in that makes a lot of sense. So thank you from Annie as well.
Okay, good.
So Molly wrote, being the only really active youth leader in my church, I just want our youth to see the possibility and have the experiences or sacred memories that I have had through youth ministry, and to have their own. So I think that's Molly's vision for the gathering. Thank you, Molly.
Yeah, and Molly, I would say let that be the framework. Share the story. Again, you're not trying to recreate mini Mollies. You're trying to remind them that you have a personal story, that God's story is of transformation, that there's hope and opportunity here. And the more we keep reminding people of that, that's what leading through the front is. It's not managing and dragging people along, but it's saying there's something over the hill. There's an opportunity here. Come along with me. We're going to see what's going to happen. God is up to something. Who's in? And that kind of inspirational thing is about your story. So let that story be a part of your conversation, Molly. That's really good.
Wonderful. And Rosemarie is a volunteer who is on the webinar with us, and she wrote that her vision was that she wants to help attract youth to our church by finding a way to teach how faith applies in a high school world and make them feel their voice is heard in the congregation. Thank you, Rosemarie.
Yeah, that's very good. Application of faith is critical, yeah.
Wonderful. So 2 things. 1, please keep writing in your questions. Write in also your vision for the gathering. This is so helpful. It's, well, for one, inspiring me and fun to read your visions for the gathering, but also for those who have not yet really formulated their vision. Just to see some examples is really helpful, or to hear some examples. Also, if you are watching this webinar with a group, if you could just type in the number of people all sharing a computer at your location, we'd love to know how many eyeballs were on this thing live. If you just put a number into the box, then I will know what you mean by letting us know how many people are watching. While people are thinking of the next set of questions and also writing in their vision for the gathering and their number of people watching, I wonder, Tiger, if you could share a couple books. If somebody just really wants to start at square one about how to do strategic planning in a ministry setting. Do you have anything that people could read or places to go for resources?
Yeah, you and Todd might have better ideas, because what I found is that this is something that I wrestled with early on, and I grabbed a few business books on it, and years ago, all of them probably out of print now, that started my shaping and my thinking. But I was thinking there's a few things like Purpose-Driven Youth Ministry by Doug Fields, written a few years ago, had some thoughts about this. So that's a possibility. Ginny Olson and Mike Work wrote a book called Youth Ministry Management Tools that also addressed some things about planning, and they also, by the way, in that book have a lot of forms that you can steal and adapt, which is an important youth ministry skill. So Youth Ministry Management Tools by Ginny Olson, it's a big book, could be bought, used now, Purpose-Driven Youth Ministry. And there really weren't many others. I was thinking about this after we talked, that there weren't many others that really focus on this. Bill Hybels, a pastor of a small church outside of Chicago, he has a book called Courageous Leadership he wrote a few years ago. It's bigger picture, and I don't agree with everything in it, but he had some really good stuff about leading from front that isn't specific about strategic planning, but he addresses the issue of the leader and some issues about planning. But there weren't a whole lot that I could think of that, especially small, easy to read kind of books on strategic planning. And so I don't know what else other than those ones. I was thinking about that, and I thought,
maybe this is the book we need to write.
Yes, exactly. Because strategic planning, I'll say again, I close with this little idea as people are writing in any last-minute things, that it isn't big. Please remember, as we said, it's not controlling outcomes. It's not overthinking the details, although all that's important. It's about it changes your behavior because you have a dream and a hope for something. And some have heard about a guy. For me, the beginning of the thinking was a guy when I was 19 years old and I was struggling with life and really having a hard time and ready to bail on the church and on this whole journey of faith. He met with me for 6 breakfasts. And this guy was boringly ordinary. He was a volunteer. He didn't do anything dramatic. But I believe he was a strategic planner in that he believed that inside of his circle of concern, which was be kids in the community, he knew he had a circle of influence with Tiger McLuen. And we had 6 breakfasts together, and it was a profound transformational moment, not because he controlled any of the outcomes, not because he micromanaged the conversation. I remember we talked about faith, life, God, the Bible, but I don't remember any details. I just remember the environment was clear, it was inviting, and it was hopeful. And in that experience, after 6 breakfasts, there was transformation. He dreamed, I think, in his life that he could be used by God to help kids become lifelong followers of Jesus. And those 6 breakfasts began the journey for me. And he and I have talked about that afterwards. And I believe it's because Bob was strategic. He was simple. He was not a great leader in terms of large. He was a great leader in terms of circle of influence. And I've just remained eternally grateful that he modeled for me this idea of strategic planning without getting caught up in controlling or overthinking. But what he was strategic with his use of time, strategic with his hope, and strategic with his gifts that he brought to the table. And that's always changed how I think about this.
Wonderful. And I have some really great questions. But before I get to them, Karen is wondering if you could repeat the name of the second book. Was it the Ginny Olson book maybe was the second one?
Ginny Olson and Mike Work, W-O-R-K, wrote a book called Youth Ministry Management Tools. Pretty basic, but again, it's hard cover. You could get it cheap though. Youth Ministry Management Tools by Ginny Olson and Mike Work.
Thank you. And Molly also wrote excellent guidance. Thank you. Mary asked, how does evaluation and the impact of past experience factor into strategic planning?
Great question. Again, if everything's vague, it's hard to evaluate vague. That's what strategic planning can do. So I think definitely use your past experience. Context is important. Evaluations, what I often ask, what went well, what could we have done better, and maybe if I had some clear goals, how did this event or experience or retreat help you with? And then we would put down kind of the big framework, help you with knowing more about the Bible, helping you experience service, helping us build a community where you got to know each other better. By even having your evaluation reference the core values of your planning, it helps you answer questions that are more helpful than, how was the gathering? Did you have a good time? Because having a good time is one part of it. Remember, a program is a means to an end. If the end is having a good time, if that's all the reason you're going, then use that as your evaluative question. But if your goal is, and then you'd say it's to experience service or to grow in your faith, then you evaluate it with a different question. So I would encourage Mary to think about evaluation of past experiences to help shape what went well, how does that articulate effective direction towards our goals, and then use evaluation after the event to make sure that you're close to getting at what you're hoping for. And then you'll always get the God surprises too, which is great.
Wonderful. And those are the quotes you put in the bulletin and you make sure everybody knows about.
Exactly.
Of fundraising and prayer partners and everything.
Right.
Brian asked, what are some practical steps we can take to develop non-gathering youth, family, and congregational participation as they build their gathering momentum?
So to include those who aren't going to the gathering in some of that momentum.
Yes.
It's a great question, because if you create, an insider-outsider perspective, which is partly unavoidable when you have a big experience. Yeah, that's a great question, and maybe it's thinking in terms of as you're planning for the gathering, to make sure you don't only use gathering language, that you don't only have special meetings with the gathering group, that you might even think in terms of fundraising that really could be including other people, that they would enjoy being a part of it even though they can't go to the gathering. That's a tough one, because you guys have to work really hard to make that thing happen, and there's a lot of extra work and therefore extra community building, and you have to be intentional. And every context is a little different, but I wish I had 3 easy answers for that. Oh, that's a great question. And on the flip side, you always have the struggle after a good event experience to not just have insider jokes all the time on the backside of it that exclude everybody who didn't go. So I don't think I answered that very well.
Well, we can keep working that, and I can connect you with Brian later,
Yeah.
and we can continue that conversation. Rosemary said, can you recommend a non-threatening way to encourage youth without parental support to take risks a little and participate in activities?
Activities in the church to become more involved, is that?
Yes, like
Okay.
someone who doesn't have parental support being more involved with the church.
Circle of influence, let's use that again. That's if you build a relationship with that student, invite them, and your youth group is a safe place for them, that's really wonderful. I love the family ministry model that includes parents, but you and I all are working with kids who come out of family systems that isn't all that supportive. So we have to be committed to our circle of influence, which is to invite and care, encourage them to come, welcome them when they come, build relationships with them, because they need to hear good news. And I was that kid, Rosemary. So Bob was that guy. And so you can do that. You come alongside them, encourage them, even though their parents aren't that involved. And always hope and pray that parents would get involved. But keep doing age-appropriate, distinct, quality, inviting youth ministry, and have caring adults who are sensitive to the dynamics of that particular kid and care about him or her and are interested in the world. I think you can do a lot with that kid. So keep working with them. That's great.
Wonderful. And your Bob example is that it doesn't just rest on the shoulders of the designated youth worker to bring those other kids in. You have the whole, congregation full of people who might really resonate with that kid, and you match them up with another volunteer who is willing. And
very true, yeah.
Wonderful.
Very true.
Brian, before I get to the next little vision for the gathering, Brian wrote, yeah, it was a hard question, and he doesn't have any good answers either.
Well, thanks.
But, you know, as the expert, it's always worth it. Stump the band, right? It just doesn't feel like the kingdom of God when people are excluded or left out of movements that we believe are participating in God's work. Thank you, Brian. It's a very good point.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Gina wrote, Gina, I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong, but she has a great vision. It says, part of my vision for the gathering is for the youth in our congregation to have an opportunity to grow spiritually and share their experience with others outside the church, their friends, family, community members, and hopefully bring God into others' lives or share how he has impacted their lives. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So Molly wrote, a man at my church always says, thanks for getting up this morning, recognizing that she's a teenager and sleep is important. It's the little things.
That's a great example.
Right. Very practical. That's it. And Gina, thank you for letting me know. It's Jean with an A, so thank you. Sorry that I mispronounced at the beginning there. So those are the visions we have. Do you have any kind of closing thoughts, Tiger? We just have a couple minutes left. And not to put you on the spot, but I don't want to cut you off without you sort of restating your main point or the main takeaway.
Yeah, I think they probably heard it, that I worry when we start talking about strategic planning and vision, because right away people go at 30,000 feet. And you and I, in this webinar, I think are more on the ground. And to think in terms of that circle of influence. Who are they? I would encourage you to write down their names. Who has God given you? And have every leader, volunteer, staff to just do that. And who has God given you that is your circle of influence? And then pray strategically that together you can make a difference in the lives of kids. Don't quit praying that God would use you. Don't quit believing that the transformation can occur. Don't let the program run everything. Let your dreams and visions and hopes begin to shape how you use programs and what you do this summer. So it's all because we want kids' lives to be changed.
Great. And Gina, you asked how we view the first 3 webinars, and I am going to switch to that slide in just a moment. So thank you for setting me up for my closing statements. Thank you, Gina. But first, Tiger, thank you for being with us.
It's great to be here.
Thank you. And Tiger will be with us again on our next webinar. It will be Sunday, December 4th at 2 o'clock Central, and it's going to be great. So please come for that one too. It's going to be interactive just like this with all new content and new subjects to dig into. A couple of quick reminders. This webinar...
Dawn, I hate to interrupt, but I think the December 4th one is at 3.
You are right, and my notes are wrong. Thank you for correcting me. That was definitely worth interrupting me. I wrote it wrong on my notes.
I will be on a plane at 2 o'clock.
Thank you. We got to make sure Tiger is available. I think he has a flight that we're going to work around. So thank you for making time for us today also. So this webinar is being recorded and it'll be archived at the ELCA Youth Ministry Network website. So please, please download it. It's for you. You can use it with other members of your congregation, share it with volunteers, share it with colleagues, whoever you can think of that might benefit. This and all 7 webinars will be presented as workshops at the ELCA Youth Ministry Network Extravaganza in February in New Orleans. So for those who don't know, the Extravaganza is the church's annual gathering for adult leaders in children's and youth ministry. And these are great speakers, workshops, and music. This year's theme is Go, and the event focuses on spiritual renewal, great continuing education, and opportunities to network with others who are doing the same kind of ministry. You'll also have the opportunity then to interact live with Tiger as well as the previous speakers you've heard on these webinars, Jeremy Myers and Terry Elton. So more information about the extravaganza and how to register for it is available at elcaymnet.org/extravaganza, and the address is there on your screen. Also, each synod in the ELCA has a trained coach who will be offering our training seminars, as well as the content from some of these webinars locally in your own synod. You can look at the calendar to find your local training by going to elcaymnet.org/ELCA training overview, and that address is there again on your screen. So our next webinar with Tiger, and I'm going to get the time right this time. It's Sunday, December 4th at 3 o'clock Central. You can register by going to elcaymnet.org/ELCA training overview. And I know the screen there says 2, and that's my fault. It's 3 o'clock, and we will have that correct on the website when you register as well. And that will be on leading a small group. But thank you today for joining us. Again, my name is Dawn Troutman, and I have appreciated having you here. And we will see you again or hear from you in a couple weeks. Goodbye.
Right.